Hi ladies, this is Mrs. Blaufuss again, and today we're going to look at lesson 1.6. It starts on page 60 of your textbook, and it's about special quadrilaterals. We have already looked at some special triangles. We looked at, isosceles triangles and equilateral triangles, acute triangles, and obtuse triangles, right triangles, scalene triangles, but now we're going to look at some quadrilaterals. So here are some vocabulary terms related to special quadrilaterals. These are names of specific quadrilaterals. So they all have four sides, they all have four angles, but they each have their own special definition. If you look at this picture on this next slide, you can see that a lot of these shapes in the photo are made up of triangles, but you may also recognize a bunch of quadrilaterals in there. So in the diagram, the pyramids are made up of triangles, but within the pyramids you can see a whole bunch of quadrilaterals. They look like rhombuses or rectangles maybe, or maybe squares. But if you see how they're reflected, if you can see the reflection, the two triangles being reflected form a quadrilateral. And we'll look at some of those specific names for those. So the first quadrilateral that we're going to look at is a trapezoid. So look at the examples of trapezoids here and the examples of not trapezoids, and see if you can come up with a concrete definition. While you're generating your definition, feel free to pause the video. A trapezoid is a quadrilateral with exactly one pair of parallel sides. So here we see these sides are parallel, this pair of sides is parallel, and this pair of sides is parallel, and there's just one set of parallel sides. So looking at all of these quadrilaterals, which one is a trapezoid? We specified in our definition that there is exactly one pair of parallel sides, so that's letter B. Now look at the examples of kites and the not kites and see if you can come up with a concrete definition of kites. A kite is a quadrilateral with two distinct pairs of consecutive congruent sides. So these are consecutive congruent sides, and these are consecutive congruent sides, and there are two pairs of that. So again, consecutive congruent sides here, and consecutive congruent sides here, and same with the last one, two consecutive congruent sides, and another set of consecutive congruent sides. Now, this one has two distinct pairs of consecutive, well, one pair of consecutive congruent sides and another pair of congruent sides, but they are not consecutive, and it's not a quadrilateral because it has 5 sides. So on all the not kite examples, see if you can go through and figure out why each one is not a kite. I'm using my laptop for this video, so it's not quite as loud, the tapping, but my stylus doesn't work quite as well either. So you'll have to make sure that you get the full definition that I said. So which of these figures below is a kite? Remember, a kite has to have two distinct pairs of consecutive congruent sides. So we're going to rule out A because it has nothing, none of the sides are labeled congruent. Same with B, it indicates that they are parallel but not congruent. C, we have two distinct pairs of consecutive congruent sides. Not D because it says all four of the sides are congruent and we need two distinct pairs. Not E, it says nothing about congruence there. And F only indicates congruent angles. Next, we're going to define parallelogram. So look at the parallelograms and the not parallelograms and see if you can determine a solid definition for a parallelogram. A parallelogram is a quadrilateral with two pairs of parallel sides. So here's one pair of parallel sides, and here's another pair of parallel sides. Here's one pair of parallel sides, and here's another pair of parallel sides. In this next example, although it does have two pairs of parallel sides, it is not a quadrilateral because it has 6 sides, therefore it's a hexagon. This next example does not give any indication that any lines are parallel. And the last example only has one pair of parallel sides, therefore not a parallelogram. So which of the figures below is a parallelogram? We need two pairs of parallel sides. So A has two pairs of parallel sides, B only has one pair of parallel sides, C does not indicate that any sides are parallel, D also has two pairs of parallel sides, E does not indicate any sides are parallel, and F also indicates that it has two pairs of parallel sides. Now take a minute to look at the rhombus. A rhombus is an equilateral parallelogram. So remember the word equilateral. That means that all 4 sides are congruent. So if we're talking about an equilateral quadrilateral, it has 4 congruent sides. So all 4 sides are congruent, and it's a parallelogram, which means that it has 2 pairs of parallel lines. Here's one pair, and here's 2 pairs. On the not rhombus side, the first one is not a rhombus because not all 4 sides are congruent. Same with this next one, there's no indication of any congruent sides. And the last one is not a rhombus because first of all, it's not a quadrilateral, and second of all, because it does not indicate that it's also a parallelogram. So although all sides are congruent, it has 5 sides, which makes it a pentagon, and it has no indication of parallel lines. So looking at the figures below, which of them are rhombuses, or which one is a rhombus? A is not a rhombus. Well, we don't know it's a rhombus because it doesn't have any indication of congruent sides. B is not a parallelogram and therefore not a rhombus. C, same thing, not a parallelogram and therefore not a rhombus. D has 2 sets of parallel sides and all 4 sides are congruent. So D is a rhombus. E does not give any congruence markings or any parallel line markings. And F, although it has congruent angles, we're looking for congruent sides. Now look at the rectangles and the not rectangles and see if you can come up with a definition. A rectangle is a quadrilateral that has 4 equal angles and is a parallelogram. So a rectangle is an equiangular parallelogram. So here we have 4 equal angles, and it's a parallelogram because it has 2 sets of parallel lines. Here we have 4 congruent angles, which makes it equiangular, and it has 2 sets of parallel lines. This is not a parallelogram because it's not a quadrilateral. Although this is a parallelogram, there's no indication that all angles are congruent. And this last one, not a rectangle, because first of all, it's no indication that it's a parallelogram. And secondly, because all 4 angles are not congruent. So which of these figures below is a rectangle? Although A looks like a rectangle, it does not have any markings that indicate all angles are congruent, so not A. Same with B, there are no markings that indicate it's congruent and it's missing its second set of parallel line markings. C does not qualify as a parallelogram. D does not have any equiangular markings. E does not have parallel line markings or angle markings. So the only one is F because it has 4 equal angles and 2 sets of parallel lines. So it's an equiangular parallelogram. Now look at the squares and the not squares. The squares they are an equilateral rectangle. It's an equiangular rhombus, and it is a regular quadrilateral. So the equilateral rectangle means it has 4 equal angles and 4 congruent sides. So here's our 4 congruent sides. Here's our 4 congruent angles. And it's a parallelogram. So it has 2 sets of parallel lines. So in the next square, ABCD, you can see that it is equiangular, that it is equilateral, and that it is also a parallelogram. This first one is not a square because it does not have parallel line markings and it does not have equiangular markings. Second one is not a square because it does not have equilateral markings or parallel line markings. And the last one is not a square because it is not a quadrilateral. So which of the figures below is a square? We cannot conclude A is a square because it doesn't have equilateral markings or equiangular markings. B is not a square because it only has 1 set of parallel lines, doesn't have equilateral markings or equiangular markings. C is not a square. D is not a square. E is not a square. And F is not a square. The thing F is missing is those 4 equal sides or 4 congruent sides. Oops. So here are the definitions that we gave through the lesson: trapezoid, kite, parallelogram, rhombus, rectangle, and square. So now on your own with the lesson, answer these 3 summarizing questions. What kind of quadrilateral is formed by joining 2 congruent triangles along a corresponding side? So that means if these two triangles are congruent, this shares a side. What do you know about that? And what if the triangles are equilateral? What if the triangles are right triangles? And then also please do the extra example that you have on your note sheet. And lastly, the closing question. What kinds of triangles would you combine to make a square? And what about to make a trapezoid? So please feel free to rewind, replay, or please come see me if you have any questions. Thanks, ladies.